Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hey you guys, welcome to Knowing Animals, the podcast. Knowing Animals is a podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan and I do like knowing animals. Now this episode of Knowing Animals, as always, is brought to you by our very good friends at ASA. ASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association. ASA is the membership organisation for animal studies scholars in Australia, in New Zealand and around the world. ASA has a fantastically active Facebook page in which they post information about upcoming conferences, events, exhibitions, calls for papers, funding opportunities, and they also have their own website. So why not check out ASA, the Australasian Animal Studies Association, online, and also think about joining ASA. Membership is just $50. Support the organisation that supports animal studies scholars. So this episode of Knowing Animals is coming to you from Sydney town, where I'm lucky enough to be joined by a colleague of mine, one Dr. Peter Chen. Now, Peter is Senior Lecturer in the Department of Government and International Relations at the University of Sydney, the university from which I graduated with my highest degree. Today we're going to discuss Peter's latest book, which is Animal Welfare in Australia, Politics and Policy. And the book was published by Sydney University Press in 2016. Welcome to the podcast, Peter.
Thank you very much for having me. It's great to be here.
Thank you, Peter. Now we're off to the Minding Animals conference in Mexico very soon. So we were just practicing our limited Spanish, but we've agreed to conduct this interview in English.
Yes, so as I understand it, you could conduct the entire interview in Spanish, a beautiful, slight Bolivian accent, whereas I would sit there mutely muttering something about un mesa occasionally.
So we will conduct it in English, but perhaps we'll reconvene after the Mexico trip and be fluent Spanish speakers.
Excellent.
But Peter, can you start by telling me and the listeners what inspired you to write this book?
Yeah, thank you very much. So basically, I'm a political scientist and my work for a long time had been in Australian politics and media politics and things like that. And while I had a personal interest in animal welfare issues, it remained a personal interest for many decades. And so following the temporary suspension of live exports following the Four Corners expose on slaughter practices in Indonesia, I was struck by the amazing sort of tsunami of popular outrage. And talking with some politicians, they said, we've never seen an issue where we've received so many calls to the office. And politicians are very sensitive to that sort of thing. So they do actually use the number of calls and handwritten letters and things like that as a bit of a gauge of public opinion. So if politicians are saying this is an unusual event, it is unusual. And so, that got me thinking as a political scientist. And then really, there wasn't a lot of work in Australia from the political science discipline. So there's your book, for example, which I consider a work of political science, though it also has a sort of, political philosophy kind of component to it. And there's other work from Australians and in Australia, but not really necessarily what we'd call sort of political science and particularly policy-making literature. And so I guess with a slight degree of hubris, I said, well, I'm going to write a book on this because there's a kind of gap in that literature. And that kind of led to 3 years of sort of developing and writing that volume, yeah.
Yeah, I noticed that in the introduction you mentioned the temporary ban on live animal exports as a kind of a watershed moment in your thinking about the issue. Why do you think that grabbed the attention of, say, politicians and the community so strongly?
Yeah, I mean, it in a sense, it is like other events that's occurred. So there have been some sort of spikes in public opinion in Australia, particularly around live export issues. And previously, some of the exports, particularly of sheep to Saudi Arabia and the Middle East, have caused some degree of consternation. And then during the writing period, it was very interesting that there was a kind of mini sort of spike in popular mobilisation around the use of drum lines to catch sharks. And that's another very interesting one, which unlike terrestrial mammals, which are generally seen as sort of a kind of harmless species, sharks are generally regarded, particularly in Australia, as the kind of stuff of nightmares. And so to see kind of, large protests mobilising around that issue, I thought was very interesting. So I think what is kind of interesting is there is really a disparity between the policy-making process and policy outputs around animal welfare and where community standards are. And that's not to say that the community standards have actually, significantly changed, though they have changed, I think, over a number of decades, or that community standards have a degree of coherency to them, because I think one of the things that characterises humans' relations with animals is extremely idiosyncratic and unstructured way in which the public think about animals and their welfare. But certainly I think it was a period where one of those gaps between elite and insider policy process, particularly things that go on within policy domains, and popular opinion was demonstrated to be quite a big gulf. And I think that was kind of interesting. But also, as I do say in the book, I think some of the activists who saw this as a breakthrough moment discounted the extent to which Australia's history of racial politics and policy making played a role. And I think the issue of Indonesia, Schapelle Corby, the treatment of, as they were often described, our cattle in Indonesia by foreigners also had a part to play. So there was both, I guess, what you might call a kind of positive upwelling of popular concern for these animals, but also it was very complex in the way it was constructed. And so as a political scientist, this is an interesting, understudied and complex policy space where there are both extremely clear scientific and kind of technical aspects about industry policy and welfare standards that have a kind of evidentiary base, plus all those interesting things about values, emotions, public opinion. So I guess on a more kind of pragmatic level as a political scientist is actually just a more interesting policy domain space than some policy domain spaces are. Not all policy areas are fascinating and interesting. This is actually also a fascinating and interesting one. And I guess the kind of dumb thing for me was it was sort of under my nose for about 20 years and I kind of, continued to doodle away in different places.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it's an absolutely fascinating case study into the intersection between politics and policy. I wish more of our colleagues, though, found it as interesting as we do.
Well, I guess, every academic finds their own area particularly fascinating and thinks everyone else is an idiot for not studying it, right? But I think it is interesting. But I think that also reflects the general kind of, quote unquote underlying policy issue in that there's this massive industrial system that leads to incredible mistreatment and suffering that isn't defined as being abnormal or cruel, that is a kind of normal practice that occurs that we're so just inured to as a population that it's unremarkable. And I guess these sort of policy areas where we're dealing with these unmarked categories, right, seem completely naturalised until people come along and blow them up and make them political, they politicise them. And I think one of the interesting things is those areas always lead to intense political backlash as well. And so, I was reading in the paper today that the Treasurer is talking about, the way in which, Christians are kind of being ridiculed and things like that. And, he's going to fight back about it. And in a sense, it sort of shows that once these, untouchable categories get sort of poked and potted and the political rights and wrongs of them that we've seen through the same-sex marriage debate, but also things like the Royal Commission into Institutional Abuse that hasn't just focused on the church but has also focused on the church, starts to crack these unassailable practices and institutions apart. The way people respond to them is actually very intense. And so I find that particularly interesting, and certainly the rhetoric that animal protectionists have used for many years has often been accused of being hysterical. But in my study, I also find that defenders of industry practice often use just incredibly what you might call kind of hysterical kind of language. And I think that's a very interesting aspect of the political side of the equation.
So your focus is on what you describe as three crucial policy actors, activists, industry and policy-making elites. Can you say something about the role that each of those three groups or sets of actors play in influencing animal welfare policy-making in Australia?
Yeah, okay. So I think these are specific to different jurisdictions, right? So if we start with industry, for example, I mean, one of the things that most people would agree is that industry has a high degree of autonomy with regards to how they run industry policy. And for some activists, that's an example of a massive kind of conspiracy that exists that favours industry. And certainly to some extent, there is a kind of truth in that. But in addition, I think Australia is unique in that we're a country that historically was extremely dependent on agricultural production, but became one of the most enthusiastic adopters of deregulation and neoliberal policy in the 1970s and 1980s under both, coalition and Labor governments. And so industry both runs its own shop, but is also quite ignored by government in many ways. And so animal activists often see animal using industries as particularly powerful, but their power is limited partly because they don't receive a lot of interventions and subventions from the state anymore as they once did. But in exchange, they've been allowed to kind of run their own shop. So they're a key actor in that the sort of activities that they engage in are important. But also what I'd say is that industrial actors are variegated in the way in which they behave. And so one of the things that I think was particularly important in Australia was identifying how supply chains and production systems are important in explaining highly different outcomes with regards to different species. And so if you take species that have some similar aspect to them, let's say take pigs and chickens that are both subject to considerable confinement in terms of their production system, just the scale of operations of those two industries and the relationship between major producers and their production facilities is extremely different, leading to very, very different outcomes about how different power actors within the supply chain structure can influence. In addition, I guess one of the things that I found very interesting was how the supermarket duopoly in Australia is powerful in setting standards. So overall, what I argued was a lot of the kind of welfare standards in Australia largely come out of industry, that industry isn't homogenised and that it does work at sometimes to improve standards, but those depend on factors about the nature of production, alternative sources of export or not, alternative competition for import, the size of the industry and whether they produce differentiated or undifferentiated products. And so what that means is that welfare standards are quite different across different species, but not necessarily on the basis of an evidence basis that you might say, well, we should treat pigs better than chickens because of higher cognitive functions, for example. Pigs might be treated better than chickens or not, and is unrelated to those basic arguments. So that's the first major actor. The second major actor, I guess, are the activists, animal protection and advocacy organisations. And I think they're interesting because they have had a big role in driving public changes to public opinion in Australia, but also acting as monitorial agents of monitorial democracy, to use Shudson's expression, that they monitor the behaviour and conduct of industrial actors. They raise attention about issues to the public, and they promote those sort of issues. And I think this is interesting in that what it shows you is that government is not actually an extremely important actor in this area. It could be, but it chooses not to be in many ways. And so if we compare Australia to a jurisdiction, say, like the Netherlands, for example, it's kind of famous for the existence of, strong animal supporting political parties and improvements in animal welfare systems, and yet has a very traditional kind of agricultural basis like Australia in many ways. The role of government is extremely different in these two jurisdictions. And so government in Australia has this kind of potential, but because it has been relatively disengaged from significant welfare regulation and standard makings for some time, its capacity to act is quite limited. And I think a good example that came out actually after my book was finished, unfortunately, was the case of the live export ban in New South Wales, where the government jumped in really on the basis of quite strong evidence of industrial malfeasance from that industry. But because they didn't really have much skin in the game in terms of regulatory experience or engagement, or had been very involved in regulation, they'd been quite happy to punt regulating greyhounds out to basically an industry-controlled body. When they came to intervene, they actually were ropey-doped by public opinion being mobilised against them, whereas I think a more competent and capable administration would have been more effective in taking action there. And so I think Australia is very interesting in terms of its laissez-fairness, but all the various actors think each other are more powerful, I think, than they are. And I think that's the really interesting story. So if you talk to industrial people, they see animal activists with cameras infiltrating their organisations all over the shop. When you talk to advocates, they think the government and industry are collaborating with the Illuminati to create, extremely powerful iron triangle to block out reform. If you talk to the government, they think industry can whip up public opinion whenever they want. And in some regards, some of those are right, but they're not universally right. So it is an interesting area. And in the midst of that, the missing group is obviously the public, who theoretically all these people are servicing in one way or another, either as monitorial agents for the activists in terms of supplying the quote-unquote protein or whatever that they want in terms of the industry, and acting as a conduit, regulator, and their agent in terms of government. And they are being failed, I think, to some extent by the fact that everybody thinks everyone else is more competent or powerful than they actually might be.
Fascinating. So just the other day, a story broke about alleged collusion between the New South Wales Department of Agriculture and egg producers to block out animal activists. And it was really just that picture you paint of everyone pointing the finger at everyone else. Although it did strike me that there seemed to be a cosier relationship between industry and government in that particular scenario. Yeah,
no, I think that's absolutely correct. And particularly in some areas, government acts really as a booster for industry. But the extent to which some of these agricultural bureaucrats are very engaged in the welfare side of things as opposed to other aspects is actually overstated. And I think that's a really good example where industry was allowed to some extent kind of set up a working group to deal with these new standards around egg production to attempt to kind of obviously water them down, and was sort of had government captured to some extent. But if you actually go and look at these regulatory agencies within government, you find that they're pretty thin organisationally. So they can have a few meetings, but it's not like a big, it's not like the military-industrial complex in terms of its scale. And I think that's really interesting, and it does point to some extent to both the underlying structure of the way in which certain regulations around animals, and really we're thinking about industrial animal use, with the exclusion of those used in scientific research, tend to be folded into departments of agriculture. Those departments of agriculture tend to be where they are more aligned with the National Party, or in periods of Labor government, country Labor members, and they have a relatively straightforward view that industry just needs to be developed and promoted. And, a member of Parliament sort of said to me, his major concern was making sure Australians get enough protein. Well, Australia is moving into kind of this kind of obese category. It's not really that kind of story anymore, and that shows a degree of unsophistication. So I think there are concerns that are genuine there, but I also think when activists actually look, they find the industrial actors are the powerful ones relatively, because they actually have resources they put into standards making and lobbying and things like that. And the bureaucrats are not that particularly engaged, partly because even if they want to be, they find they don't have political support. And so bureaucrats are often aimed as accused of being in the pockets of industry. It'd be very interesting to see a period of time where ministerial level government spends a fair amount of political capital thinking about these policy issues, and whether that would change the bolshiness and autonomy of bureaucrats.
Fascinating. Well, it sounds like an absolutely compelling, stimulating, complex research field. My hope is that you can continue to do this research into the future. Now, Peter, I ask everybody who comes on Knowing Animals to answer 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
Okay.
Ooh. Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
Yes, it's a bit of a cliche actually. Animal liberation. Yes, long time ago. I don't know if there were that many alternatives around, to be honest, but yeah, is that embarrassing?
No, not at all. Not at all.
Maybe I could say, but it was the graphic novel version or something. Make me sound a bit cooler. Yeah.
The fan fiction version.
Yeah.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
Again, another embarrassing thing. The first piece of specifically animal-related scholarship I ever wrote and published is this book. Right. And so I think I'm going to underline what I said earlier on. There was a degree of hubris in that decision, I think, to do that.
You went big.
Yes, maybe that's a mistake.
If you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
It'd be Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan.
Oh.
Well, I mean, and you may laugh at that, but it's actually true. So one of the things I sort of said was, if we look at political scientists' work as opposed to political theorists or moral philosophers or other people, you're the only other political scientist really in Australia who does this work. Now, there are other political scientists who work on agricultural issues, but they tend to be far more in industry policy, and welfare issues are not really their concern. And some of the work is very good. Linda Bottrell's work I've used a lot, Darren Halpin's work, and things like that. But that tends to be more about agricultural lobbyists and farming policy. So, I was inspired by your book. Your book I do see as a hybrid book with, an aspect of political philosophy to it. So I got to say, it does say in the start of my book, this isn't a book of advocacy. It's actually a book of political science. And I did that deliberately to get access to industry people, though that was actually quite difficult, and political elites, and that was quite difficult because they do treat academics with skepticism. But yes, I would name you. If I had to name a person other than you, just so I'm not accused of favouritism, Lyle Munro's work I really admire, actually, who was working in political sociology in Australia for a long period of time. And I adore his historical analysis and I couldn't get enough of it when I was working on my book.
Wonderful. Well, I'm very touched, as I'm sure Lionel it is, isn't it, Lionel?
Lyle.
Oh, now we've confused ourselves. Yeah. Anyway, as the other fellow who got named second will be.
Edit that.
So, Peter, what's the most important thing academics can do for animals?
That's an interesting question and a hard one, actually, because I don't overstate the impact of academics. So what I'd say is I think we have to be cautious about overstating our impact, right? So one of the things that I found about this area is it's the degree to which it's about emotions, it's about socialisation, it's about rituals, the ritual of the Christmas roast. Australians cook a Christmas roast every year. It's 40 degrees and they sit around doing this English tradition. It's 200 years old and yet it persists. It shows you the persistence of these kind of social rituals. So I think the first thing, I guess, is probably a bit of humility that we're probably not as influential as we think. But I also think from my research, I argue very strongly that there were 2 very distinctive waves of animal advocacy in Australia, one leading up to the start of the 20th century, which then actually demobilised and became fallow for a period of almost 70 years. And so one of the things I think that activistly oriented academics can do is maintain the area of study if and possibly when it actually comes off the boil again, because we often like to think that progression is this constant story of improvement, but actually there was this big period of time in the Australian history in the 20th century where animals were given less consideration than they were in the 19th century, and most people don't realise that, I think.
Yeah, it's hard to picture. I accept that it may well. In fact, history perhaps points us towards thinking it will happen, but it is a bit difficult to envisage at this point in time. So.
Yeah, but I think talking about Munro's work, for example, the political sociology talks about, these kind of life cycles of social movements and things like that. But also I think you have to remember that nothing mobilises counter movements like success. And so if we think about the live export ban in 2011, well, live export in Australia has massively expanded since that time. So if you thought at 2011, look, there's been this breakthrough, Australians are really starting to see the problems of this kind of industry, then those people would be appalled to see, you know, massive expansion in live export into Indonesia, massive expansion of live export into an extremely hungry market like China, the government, you know, investing new money into this, having wound up the, you know, National Advisory Committee under Tony Abbott and things like that. So I think in a small way it shows you that nothing mobilises like failure in political life. So, you know, I don't want to be a downer, but I think academics have to run against fads to some extent. And if this is inherently an important area of work, then it needs to be continued even when it's not, you know, popular, I guess. And I guess my colleagues in political economy at the University of Sydney would say, yes, you know, we understand that. You know, we've kept kind of alternative sort of heterodox political economy models live and subject to academic consideration during the height of neoliberalism. And now that neoliberalism is, you know, fundamentally under intellectual challenge, we are the engine to which alternative ideas are going to arise.
Wonderful. Final question. If you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
I think it would be a basic epistemological position, and that would be something about humans' ability to think in non-anthropocentric mental kind of states. And I think, you know, a good example is obviously all this amazing research about octopus and their, you know, incredible tool using and other form, you know, social characteristics, and yet they don't have a mental state that we can envisage. And I think because of that fundamental incapacity, it is going to continue to lead humans to have these kind of extremely idiosyncratic kind of ways in which different animals are treated differently for no good reason other than, you know, their perceived similarity to us cognitively. So the ability to kind of imagine beyond the ways in which we think. And I think that that's important partly for non-human animals, but I also think, you know, it's important for intercultural understandings as well, you know, because it talks to that sort of ability to put yourself in people's shoes at a more fundamental level, and also about your different ability status and things like that. And maybe that is happening with the way in which, you know, we're having much more refreshing discussions about, say, mental health and things like that over the last decade. But that would be what I would change, yeah.
So, Peter, what are you working on next?
Well, I'm working on comparative work. I've got a great research collaborator. She's a real expert in the field. She knows everyone and talks to everyone. And so currently just in some preliminary work looking at animal activism in New Zealand as part of an initial step into building up a matching kind of case study with the New Zealand case. And then hopefully that will expand into other jurisdictions and adding the kind of comparative work. And I just think really, while there has been this kind of political turn in animal studies, that still does come out of the political philosophy area. And maybe it would be nice to see more graduate students coming in as, you know, more mainstream political scientists and policy writers into the area. So that's what I'm hoping to work on.
Wouldn't that be nice? So, Peter, where can people find out more about your work?
Okay, so they should really go to Sydney University Press and just Google that. And as of this end of this year, my book became open access. So you can actually go to Sydney University Press. You'll see my book on the main page. You can click through and you can get the open access version for free. And download the point and have it all to yourself. Print out copies, give them to your friends for Christmas. Nothing says page turner like a dry piece of political science.
Wonderful. That's fantastic, and it's really good to see Sydney University Press supporting animal studies scholars and also supporting open access. So, Peter, thank you so much for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast, where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. Now, to the listeners, are you following us on Twitter at knowing_animals, or have you liked us on Facebook at Knowing Animals? More importantly, have you left a review at iTunes? Reviews send us skyrocketing up in the iTunes ratings and therefore makes it easier for other people to find the podcast. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan and I do like knowing animals.